So I'm the author of the SANS Top 4 Mitigation Strategies course, where we basically train security people how to implement the top 4 within organisations. I've worked with the top 35 for about the last 5 years now, since about 2009, and my focus is really on endpoint security. And also I make terrible music that's too fast to dance to in my spare time. And this presentation is just about my technical experience and sharing that with you. I can provide a copy of this slide deck at the end as well. There's lots of URLs in it, so don't bother trying to go through and actually write all this stuff down. I can give you a copy. And also, we're a bit time limited, so I'm not going to be able to go through every single strategy, but I'll cover the most important ones. One of the things that I've really learned about the top 35 is some people jump in and try and do these strategies, as they say, like, we need to do application whitelisting, we need to do patching, but it's actually built upon a level of maturity in the organisation, and the top 35 assumes a level of existing maturity that the majority of federal government agencies are already at. But it's worth noting that sometimes before just going straight to the strategy, there's a little bit of groundwork that we need to do. And it's just worth calling out, I think. But we're going to jump into the strategies, and the first strategy, which my main interest is application whitelisting. So when we strive to perform application whitelisting, really the ultimate intent is to achieve a significantly improved level against malware of protection. Government organisations are really guided by the recommendations that ASD make. And each organisation ends up with a slightly different application whitelisting reality. But in many cases, the key driver is compliance over security. We've all had the auditors come in and say, hey, you need to do whitelisting, you need to do it by next week, and you need to get it done. And ASD have relaxed the rules in recent years in the ISM a little bit, because possibly the bar was raised too high. But we really need to make sure that the objective is ultimately security. So what is our reality? Just like Tweety Bird's face there when you're under the ice cream wrapper. Sometimes it's not always what it appears. But there's many interpretations of ISM controls out there, okay? Not just the whitelisting ones. And really the key question is, what is a good enough application whitelisting implementation? I've had many discussions on Unsecure and with many different people about, DLL whitelisting. You'd be totally crazy to do that. It's ridiculous. It would, have too much overhead. I don't personally think that, but that's the discussions that we need to have as a community. And so what I did was I first started trying to answer the question, what is a good enough implementation, about 4 years ago, thought long and hard about it. And it resulted in a document called the Top 4 Maturity Model, which you can get from the Foresight Consulting website. And what this document does is it aims to provide a series of questions that try and determine basically what level of security you're getting back from your application whitelist. So for example, if you put in a whitelist rule that says exclude everything on the C drive, but tick we're doing whitelisting, it would really reflect that the security benefit you're getting out of the solution is little to none. So it's worth checking out. Some of the other problems is many security teams aren't really aware of their whitelist rule set. I've spoken to a lot of people that have said, oh, it's the operations guys that have gone and actually implemented that. We haven't actually looked at the rule set, and that's a difficult problem because the ops guys have a lot of priorities. They often get provided with little guidance for implementation, and then when they do implement it, they just whitelist everything to make it work, ultimately. And then, management says it's implemented and you get a big tick, and that's the end of it. And ops guys don't really focus on security in a lot of cases. I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, but they're very busy people, and their primary driver really is business continuity. And when you provide management of a security control to the ops guys, often the business continuity will win out at the end of the day. And the key to avoiding this situation is really understanding, planning, and some ongoing auditing. And often we don't appreciate the limitations of some technologies that we're using to perform application whitelisting, and we go full steam ahead, and these limitations are really important to understand, and especially widely used technology across many industries, which I'm going to talk about, which is Microsoft AppLocker. So the first thing I want to do is really realign our expectations with Microsoft AppLocker. And there'll be many different opinions around this room about whether you agree with me or not. But just for a second, hear me out. I want to forget whitelisting as the objective with AppLocker, okay? And really the primary driver to achieve a more secure deployment, instead think about preventing users from writing to locations they can execute files from. Okay? If you think about that as the objective with AppLocker, you're going to end up with a much more secure deployment, because thinking of the objective this way ensures that folder permissions and administrative privileges are considered as part of your deployment approach, because AppLocker relies on these things to be sound in order to provide security. It's also really important to understand the limitations. Don't push the technology too hard, expect it to do things that it wasn't designed to do, and understand the boundaries you need to work within. There's a few places that people get tripped up. DLL enforcement, and I'll talk about that in a second, is very, very tricky. Whitelisting based on hash values alone can't be done. You need to use a combination of publisher rules, path rules in order to make the whitelist work. And also, the hashes that you get out of AppLocker are actually authentic hashes. They're a custom Microsoft hash, and there's SHA-256 plastered all over the documentation within AppLocker. It's in the registry saying, hey, here's your SHA-256 hash, but they're not SHA-256 hashes, they're authentic hashes. So if you're comparing the hash values of binaries that are on your system reported by AppLocker to threat intelligence sources and things like that, you're never going to get any matches. So it's just worth being aware of that. And also, in the majority of cases, administrative exemptions are required for your policy to work. Just a little bit about DLL enforcement and why it's a little bit tricky with AppLocker. This is one of the main reasons, okay? So up the top there, you've got an error message saying AppLocker, hey, we've blocked a file when they double click on a file called winrar.exe. And if that file wasn't allowed, because the user has loaded that file from Explorer, the error message is actually presented to the user shell and they see the error message. With DLL whitelisting in AppLocker, but most of the error messages are actually suppressed, okay? So, for example, they manage to load the WinRAR file and then they perform a function inside WinRAR. They click on a particular menu or something that calls a DLL to load. That DLL will be blocked. The user will never see that block message. And a couple of things can happen, right? The application could crash, the function could not work, you know, or they'll just get they will get very, very frustrated. And there is a PowerShell script that a US government employee, it's on GitHub called AppLocker Guidance. And the way they sort of got around this was there's a script that enumerates all the DLL blocks inside the event log every 5 minutes on a scheduled task and presents a separate error message to the user saying, hey, you've encountered a DLL block, to try and get around that because you know, it's hard to troubleshoot. So that's the main reason why I find DLL whitelisting is difficult. However, the main reason we use AppLocker is it's free, right? You don't have to deploy any agents, and that's okay. It's a very, very compelling reason, and it does provide a security benefit, okay? But remember, know the limits, and it has to be used in a defense-in-depth approach. And our goal is to prevent users from writing to locations they can execute files from, not necessarily whitelisting. So when implementing AppLocker, a lot of people use the default rules that still allow C Windows and C program files to run, and to run any files in those directories. And by default, unprivileged users are unable to write to these directories in the majority of cases, okay? The issue is many applications, when they install on a system, actually modify these directory permissions to allow users to write to them. So you need to be aware of this. And you can check for these modified permissions by using sysinternals access check, for an example. And for example, if you install McAfee Solid Core or any sort of Adobe Creative Cloud application, they actually change these sort of directories to allow standard users to put files in. So if you're allowing everything to run in program files, suddenly malware, untrusted executables can actually copy into these directories and actually execute. So it's worth going through and auditing that. And depending on what applications you have installed, that might be different from computer to computer. So to mitigate this risk, you need to identify these directories and then add an AppLocker exclusion rule, which says, in this case, files can execute in C program files, but not C program files, you know, McAfee Solid Core, for example. And there are some out-of-the-box Windows folders which permit unprivileged user rights, such as C Windows Temp. Also, like there's a printer and font directories out there. And these folders really need to be listed as exclusions in your list. There's a fantastic PowerShell framework which automatically adds some of these rules for you. Again, AppLocker Guidance on GitHub, very, very, very useful. However, I was thinking about this talk and talking about some of these problems, and there wasn't really an easy way for people to go in and audit it. So what I'm announcing today is we're launching basically an AppLocker auditor tool. It's completely free. What it allows you to do is to go in and it will perform a full audit of your AppLocker implementation and identify any weaknesses in your AppLocker policy out there, because I need people to be able to go in and check this, and we need non-security people can even run this tool. That was really the objective. So I'm going to demonstrate this tool now. Now my VM's being a bit weird with the mouse clicks and the external projector, but basically you run this exe, and yes, you have to put the hash of this executable in your app locker whitelist. Some weird catch-22, but we've provided it on the website. And what it does is you run this as a completely standard user. It doesn't look at group policy. It looks at what settings are actually applied to the machine. So we click enumerate down here. And what it will do is it will instantly sort of display to you all the app locker rules that are applied, okay? It will automatically go through and it will highlight in red any rules which potentially could be really bad for your security. And it will also tell you what rule types you're performing whitelisting on. It will tell you whether the app locker service is running and doing enforcement. And yeah, you can basically expand each one of these rules. It will tell you what users they apply to and if there's been any big exemptions. And I'll just bring it back here so my mouse works, because it works on here. And I'll just magnify that a little bit so you can see it a bit better. Nope, that's not going to work. Anyway, so we wanted to go a step further than just showing you what is the rule set, because a lot of people will say, well, you know, that's all good and well. I can see the rule set, but it's about making sense of it and understanding where my gaps are. So what I did was we created a file, app locker file load test, okay? So if you click next on the utility, and this is VMware, not this tool. Sorry. If I drag it back to this screen, it works. So you click next, and basically it's an untrusted file load test. And you click start, and what it's actually doing right now is it's dropping a non-trusted executable and non-trusted DLL file in every single folder that's across the C drive on your computer, and it's trying to execute it. It's testing for that execution, and it's going to report back whether that execution was successful. If you've got a lot of directories on your PC, this might take a little while to run. So what I've got is another VM where this test is actually being finished if it wakes up. And that's the results. Out of the box, we've got red rules, which say these are folders where untrusted executables and DLLs can successfully load from. So you may want to check and put exclusion rules in for those. The orange ones are where executables weren't blocked. Executables weren't able to run, but DLL files were able to execute. So that might be the case where you're not doing DLL enforcement with AppLocker, but you've got some directories which still allow users to write in and execute DLLs from. So it shows you where your risk is. Also, if we scroll down the page, it will then show you all the directories that basically aren't an issue. Also, we wanted to go another step. You click next, it will show you which ISM controls you aren't actually compliant with, depending on what your AppLocker policy is, because I really wanted to be able to have some, security managers and people that aren't necessarily down in the weeds of the tech stuff to be able to run this stuff independently and get an idea of what value they're getting back from their whitelist. So you can head over to airlockdigital.com. You can download that right now. And yeah, I hope it proves useful to anyone. And I'm hoping to hear some feedback from that if you'd like us to do anything. There's no reporting on the tool yet, so that's something we're looking to build in sort of version 1.1, which we hope will be done in a number of weeks, but just to get it done for all of this. So what are some questions we can check when we're deploying AppLocker? Are administrators exempt from whitelisting? Okay, in the majority of deployments, that will be the case. And it's just worth being aware of that so you can properly protect your admin privileges. How do I detect where AppLocker is not enforced or bypassed by administrators? Many admins will exempt themselves from the policy by doing block inheritance. And what's the strategy that we can go about finding that? There's a hotfix for Windows 7. It's not a patch in Windows, but basically a developer many years ago discovered that there were 2 code flags in Microsoft AppLocker which allow you to opt out of AppLocker at runtime of your script. So people can declare 2 flags at the start of their code, and then AppLocker will not apply to that. So this isn't a patch, this is a hotfix. You need to go and manually get that hotfix and apply it to your systems, okay? Are large path exemptions put in place? So you can check that with your AppLocker auditor tool. And where can I view my whitelisting events centrally? It's important to get centralized visibility of everything that's running in your environment. Also, configure AppLocker properly according to the NSA guidelines, and those PowerShell scripts are there to help you. And there's a great, very technical, though, guide from the NSA called Application Whitelisting using Microsoft AppLocker, which is worth checking out. So, talked enough about whitelisting. We'll go through some of the other controls now. But controls number 2 and 3, which is about patching, We all know that patching is really important at this point, okay? And the reasons why. But the biggest issues organizations have with patching isn't incompatibility or breaking things or basically any technical problem, it's the business processes around how we go about patching. And in order to do it well, you need to overcome some key things. One of the rules is you need to have some sort of vulnerability intelligence, right? You need to know when patches are coming out. Just like the Flash 0 Day came out last week, you need to know that very, very quickly. You can subscribe to, Twitter, certs around the world, RSS feeds, blogs, and also there's a tool out there, Secunia, that does a really good job of bringing this all together for your environment. You must have a sound change management process. You don't want to get caught up too much, and part of getting through change is having a documented patch management policy, and particularly stating the risk for each patch. What is the risk? So against ASD's patch guidelines. So when you go to your change control, you say, hey, this is a Flash 0 Day. Here's my calculated method of determining that this is really bad, and therefore we really need to patch this in 2 days, because the business will generally challenge you. Is it really that serious? Hey, how did you figure that out? And you need to have some sort of methodology that's agreed to in order to how you calculate risk. And also increase the time you have to patch by performing application hardening, okay? And I'm just going to jump to that, number 5 on the list. So the main objective when performing application hardening is to really lower the application's attack surface and minimize or remove the impact of application vulnerabilities. And one of the applications we have great fun patching each month is Microsoft Office. And there are a few simple things that we can do to make it a little bit easier. One is lock down all our trust center settings via group policy. A lot of people deploy Microsoft Office and don't define even the default settings. They just leave it out there in group policy, and it allows users to go in and change all these settings. We want a known security posture out there, so it's important to define all of those settings as you want them, including enforcing protected view. Okay, we want that on to make sure our sandboxing is enabled. ASD recently released a Office hardening guide, which is definitely worth checking out. And the biggest pain at the moment, which has been my security consulting work, is macros. And a lot of organizations can't disable them because their entire business revenue depends on these crazy macros, and some people legitimately use them. So there's not much you can do, and there's not much flexibility out there. So there's this thing called trusted locations where you can make macros a little bit more flexible. Okay, there was an idea that I had to give credit to Dave Severs for coming up with, where we mapped trusted locations at user login time. It's a little bit messy, but basically I was in an organization where they had users that had custom map drives, files everywhere, and we couldn't identify where those map drives were. Now, trusted locations are stored in the computer's registry, and there was a login script that mapped all these users' drives. And if you can assume that users put their files in one of their mapped locations somewhere, then you can parse their map drives, whatever they are, at login time through to the registry and define a trusted location for it. So, because we assume that the majority of users will store documents in these places, and it may help, right? Now, trusted locations, if you disable macros and users run a document from a trusted location, the macro will still actually execute without security restrictions. So, and then you say, well, Dave, but if you trust everything, what's the point? You're trusting so many places. Well, and I had many of those arguments, but we're really just trying to prevent the first click, right? So users will receive a document with a macro attached, they'll double click on it, it'll run from their email client. They don't realize that they've been phished often until they actually see the document and it's not what they were expecting. And it's unlikely that users then, at that point, are going to go, well, I might copy it from my email into my group drive and then I'm going to execute it again. And it's just a way of preventing that running first time. Also, hardening Adobe Acrobat in Java. Again, enforcing protected view in Adobe Acrobat is really, really important these days. You can use a registry key to set it, or you can set it with group policy preferences. And it stops users turning it off. By default, it's turned on, but it's not enforced, so users can change the setting. And also Java, there's not much you can do, unfortunately, other than disabling the browser plugin. And thankfully, rejoice everyone, Java 9 has dropped support for the browser plugin, so the world will slowly become a better place, which is great. We can use custom HIPS rules, and I'll talk about that in a little bit to mitigate some risk. So strategy number 4, which is restricting administrative privileges. And it's so much more than making sure that Doug and Dave and a few administrators, they're the only ones with administrator rights. There's so much more you can do to make this control more mature and better, and I'll discuss this in the maturity model. So the ultimate goal is to prevent the bad guys from obtaining administrative access, and there's many, many ways you can actually do that. And I'm going to talk about that now. So a few things to check. Ensure, and I know this is 101, but the user account control is enabled. Some organizations still don't have this enabled. It hurts my soul. But I've written a script which basically will go out, it will enumerate across thousands of computers at a time, and it will tell you whether UAC's enabled on that individual computer, okay? And it's important to check, even if you think you've got UAC enabled, because administrators might jump onto one particular server, they might not like it, they'll turn it off, they'll change the setting, you know, and it's just making sure that we're doing the auditing piece, even if you're comfortable. Then it's a really easy way to do that. Ensure your schema and enterprise admin groups are empty. Often these groups are somewhat misunderstood. They might be used for something really high privilege, so I'll stay away from them. You know, we won't, I'm too scared to remove anything from it. But I can tell you that the schema and enterprise administrators groups, their only function is for Active Directory design work, right? So adding, removing forests, setting up trusts, things of that nature. And Microsoft designed this group so that domain admins can add members back into these groups once they're done. And in the majority of cases, you can actually just remove everything from these groups. Okay, and you won't have a problem. There's no services, user level privileges that you gain by having users in these particular containers. And all it's giving is if someone else has that account, they can really start to destroy your Active Directory environment if they want to. So just clean out those groups, but I'm not liable for the weird things that happen in your environment if you do, okay? Consider a zero standing privilege approach. So that's only giving people administrative rights when they need it in an environment. Microsoft calls this just enough administration, and there's a PowerShell framework which they've created to help you implement this, and it's something to consider. Obviously, you know, you need a very mature process in order to make that possible. Also, you can just use something simple like DS query to check for inactive user accounts. This is especially important for administrators. And if you're checking every 30 days and disabling administrative accounts that are more than 30 days old, then you know, you're compliant with that ISM control 1404. But one question throughout all of this is, what is an administrator account? And it's not a question that we're often across. So it's important to audit and understand what's giving you administrative privileges within your environment, okay? So I've got a PowerShell script that goes out to, again, thousands of computers, and it will audit who is a member of the built-in administrators group on servers and computers in your environment. So you can run that across the entire environment, and it will actually tell you this group provides access to, you know, 50 machines. This user on the domain is an administrator of this one computer over here, and it's worth doing that audit because you might assume that this group on my domain is providing administrative access, but that might not always be the reality unless you're going to each endpoint and you know, checking these things. Also, there's this thing called Kerberos unconstrained delegation, and it's a computer object setting which allows services running on a domain computer to impersonate every user that authenticates to it. And the way it works is if I'm sitting on a computer and I would bait someone to connect to that computer, and they just need to connect to like an SMB share, they don't even need to log in, I would grab their Kerberos ticket and then I can do whatever I want with it, okay? And it's very dangerous. It's a fantastic way on pen tests to get domain admin, because I can send an email to a domain admin saying, hey, click here on this SMB link and, you know, connect to the computer that I'm sitting on. And there's a PowerShell command that you can run to actually check which computers have Kerberos unconstrained delegation enabled. And there's usually one or two, as I've found. So one thing you can do if you can't turn this off for some reason, it's a very legacy setting, is you can set administrative accounts as sensitive and prevent them from actually being delegated in your environment. Jumping across to number 7, which is basically install and deploy Emmet. It's fantastic for preventing vulnerability exploitation, but it can be difficult to deploy and centrally manage in the environment. And there's two methods of deploying Emmet. There's group policy Emmet templates, or there's setting registry keys via group policy. Okay. So the way I go about deploying Emmet in an organization is really by following these steps. On a computer manually, what I'll do is I'll install Emmet on the local computer, and then I'll configure Emmet exactly how I'd like, with all the applications that I want to protect. And then I will export the registry keys that contain these settings, because when you set Emmet up, it will write all these settings to the registry, export that, and then you can deploy all these registry keys centrally using group policy preferences across your network. Then when you deploy Emmet out there, it'll read in all these registry keys, it'll start to pick up the settings that you want, and then you can centralize the Emmet event log so you can tell when exploitation is happening. But there's a few things to know about Emmet, okay? There's Emmet 5.5's out now, and I'm sure a number of you will be looking at actually upgrading from 5.2, which has had some insecure stuff that was discovered by FireEye recently. And there's a crash, which some people have been encountering in the GUI. It doesn't impact the application's performance or the way it works, but it's just to be aware of. You can use Process Explorer to check whether Emmet is protecting the process by seeing whether Emmet's DLL is loaded into the process. And also, going from Emmet 5.2 to 5.5, the group policies and the registry keys are actually different. They've added a lot of new features, so you can't just install 5.5 over the top of 5.2 and expect it to work. You need to redeploy all your policies. And also, thankfully, we're dropping XP and 2K3 support, but I hope none of you out there are still running those systems, although I have a feeling you might be. Number 8 is host-based intrusion detection prevention system. So you can use HIPS engines to whitelist application behavior, and typically it requires a third-party security product. So Shakira's HIPS don't lie, obviously, and you can use Shakira to prevent the spawning of your child processes. And I know that sounds odd, but for example, if you've got actorread32.exe, you're running Adobe Reader, you don't expect it to spawn any processes that are called anything but the actual Adobe name. So you could write a simple rule that says, if the process name is not actorread32, Adobe ARM, or Reader CEF, which are standard Adobe executables, then terminate that process and log it. And basically, if that ever gets exploited, you know, the majority of bad guys will either try and spawn a child process off that, and you know, it gives you a better chance to catch it, as always, defense in depth. Some other ideas, you can monitor some registry keys in services for new service creations, and also any new keys created in a run for some persistence. There's a lot of possibilities when you start getting into this. Number 12 and 13, software-based application firewall. It's very easy to set up and maintain, and can be really used in observation mode, you know, for not too much impact. But Microsoft Windows doesn't do this very well out of the box. You've kind of got a log all the my traffic or don't log any of my traffic. So there's no real like granularity in observations. But the way you'd go about deploying this control, ultimately you're trying to prevent the network communication of any executables that you don't know about. Okay. What you do is you deploy a rule set, monitor all the traffic. You then exclude your browsers, exclude your updaters, exclude your typical Windows processes, and everything else that you think's normal in your environment. And then you're left with, hey, here's all the network communication with all these strange executables. You know, you typically see people dragging in, you know, portable Firefox, other things like that, and hopefully malware. And then you wonder what all the other executables are. But like a lot of strategies such as this, it relies upon good centralized logging for you to get visibility over everything that's happening on your network. And you can't achieve a lot of the controls on the top 35 without some good centralized logging. So, but once we've gotten all this information in centrally, then we can compare all this information with open source threat intelligence lists. And I've had a lot of success recently comparing the websites that users are visiting, you know, where their computers are calling out to DNS, and also what binaries computers are running, by comparing it with a lot of open source threat intelligence lists. And there's a few places that you can pull those down easily. You'll need a SIEM to do this. I absolutely love Splunk. But if you don't have you know, the time to go out and buy a commercial offering, there's our Logstash as well, which is very similar to Splunk and contains a lot of functionality that you can use to do all this data comparison. So, and then if you ever get a hit on any of these lists, you just automate email reports that go out to you know, your security team so they can have a look at all this data. And it has to be automated, otherwise they won't look at it. An example recently, I've been seeing lots of this Dridex stuff out at the moment, and I'm sure you have too, where users are running macros. It's trying to pull down executables from the web. And that basically allows me to see just the Dridex executables in Splunk by writing a regular expression and pulling out, you know, a certain pattern in the domain, because they tend to use, you know, similarly structured executable domains, executable names and folders on their URL. So you can start to think about ways to catch those things. Number 28, user education. So what's some proactive information we can really provide for users at home? One is if they're running Windows, install Emmet. Now you can just double click through the installer for the most part, and then it provides value. There's also haveibeenowned.com, where you can go along to that, put in any email addresses, and then see whether your usernames have been compromised or details as part of any sort of recently big data breaches. And unfortunately, users use the same username and passwords at home, so if they're aware of this, then it helps us as organizations too. Free antivirus, what are you getting? ABG now in their privacy policy is basically saying that they're selling users browsing data. So, nothing's free a lot of the time that provides a lot of value, apart from the Airlock Digital AppLocker Auditor, I must say. You could tell them to use two-factor authentication, especially on PayPal, and other places like this, and password managers as well is really good. So they're not using the same thing. Number 35, capture network traffic. It's only really useful post-breach. However, it provides a good starting point for a source of investigation. And basically it works by, you can figure out which router or your border traffic is traversing, and then set up a span port to send all of that traffic to a particular interface. And then what I've done in the past for some government organizations is I've built a laptop that runs Linux, and basically I've been capturing all those packets and just writing it to removable hard drives. It's a little bit messy, but I found that on average, if you've got about a 40 megabit of internet traffic, you get about 2 weeks on a 2 terabyte hard disk. So at the time, I went down to Dick Smith, no longer, but bought 10 hard drives, and then we were able to have sort of, quite a bit of time of packet data that we could go back if there was anything wrong, and it did come in handy. But there are commercial products such as Endace that are built to perform these type of functions. So the last one, Dave's number 36, obviously not official, but malware hunting, I think, is something really important that we need to call out. And a lot of organizations don't have the people or the skills to be able to go and do this, but there's some easy ways that you can try and identify malware out there. One thing that I love to do, and it's another one thing I love to do, is basically using auto runs. It's a sysinternals tool that you run, and it tells you about every single sort of executable or DLL that loads when the user logs onto the system. And it can help you identify a lot of malware. And there's a Kanza PowerShell framework that allows you to run auto runs, or it enables auto runs to be run across thousands of machines. And then you can pull back basically all forms of persistence across your network, and it works really, really well. And if you can find persistence, if I can play this awesome auto GIF, you get a sweet fist bump. So good job, because that's what we're ultimately trying to find in a lot of cases. But that's about it, because we're out of time. But yeah, remember the Airlock Digital AppLocker Auditor, and I hope some of that has been useful to you in your everyday job.